present to you my colleague, Dr. David Kirkland. Please join me in giving him a very warm William Paterson University welcome to our honored guest.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Dr. Russell for her warm and beautiful remarks. If I can stand here and live up to half of them, I'll do a good job. I also want to thank you all for inviting me out to talk about a subject that's close to my heart and to talk about possibilities for transforming curriculum and transforming schools. I believe that in the transformation of curriculum and the transformation of schools, we can transform a world that's in dire need of transforming. I also like to thank a few of my mentors, who are not here, but who are responsible for me being here. Dr. Geneva Smitherin, who recently retired from Michigan State University, Ann Haas Dyson at the University of Illinois, and Pedro Nogar at New York University. Now, I begin by saying that this issue of curriculum is close to my heart. So close to my heart that when I go into schools, I just left a school in Brooklyn yesterday, and I saw students whose stories reflected my own. But there is one particular student who comes to mind. He came to class late, and his teacher asked him, why wasn't he in class? And the student simply said, it's too long of a story. And it reminded me of my story, and I want to share some of that story with you today. Get over here, punk. We're going to kick your butt talking all that stuff in class. Now what's up? Hey, man, get it. Where did he go? Those were the last words I heard those boys saying. The last I saw them were the mounting fists pouring upon my head. This had become too routine in my neighborhood. Every day a posse or a gang of boys would choose someone to assault. That day I was their selection, but I was running, and the three large boys didn't catch me. This was the single code of living on Detroit's east side. That is, do whatever it takes to survive. I didn't understand why those hooligans were chasing me. I had heard one of them mention in school that they were going to get me for showing off, but all I had done was answer a few questions that our teacher posed, so I failed to understand they're calling me a teacher-pleasing nerd. Here I was again, running. It became all too common now. Whenever I was afraid, I ran. Whenever I was in any trouble, I ran. Now again, I found myself running. Running was my way of coping with the brutal situation of a depleted city. I hadn't witnessed the fall of Detroit. It probably took place years before my birth, yet I lived daily in its death. I participated in its funeral, pallbearer. I carried its tomb. Detroit was no longer a mecca for the economic upliftment of black people. By the mid-1980s, the city had been completely transformed into a dark urban dungeon that fettered people in an existence comparable to slavery. All the days that I lived in Detroit, the event of being jumped and beaten for no reason was just another example of my thraldom. My running was simply an attempt to find freedom. That day I ran home to my mother. She is a beautiful woman with blazing brown eyes. Her complexion is a sparkling bronze, and her features wear what the Bible terms strength and dignity. Standing no higher than 4 feet 9 inches, to me she is a giant. Looking into her consuming eyes, it's like looking into a mirror. Many times I had been told how much I resembled my mother. The city did not deal well with single mothers, especially those like my mother, untamed and somewhat possessed by wild spirits. For this freedom, she didn't work a job. Instead, she was demoted to social patient status, victimized by the cruel asylum of the welfare program that the state afforded many of these, quote, unfortunate, unquote, cases. Every year that my mother participated in that unforgiving program, her conscience shivered like a junkie's and her soul bled black like burning coal. She became somewhat of a dependent child on herself on this program and then on others. When I returned to her home, I found her standing by the time-beaten screen door that hung before her front wall. She was standing there, shouting words, screaming them as she argued with one of her friends. "Get out of my house. If you ain't got no money, ain't nothing you can get here. I got 2 kids I'm trying to raise. And I don't need you sucking the life out of me. Lena, why you tripping? I don't need to take this from you." And then he slapped her across her beautiful face. It seemed as though he slapped away some of the portions of her beautiful features. The gold and bronze dulled in their splendor. I was angry but afraid. I ran into her house to my room. I could not understand why she had let him slap her. I could not resolve why my 7-year-old man-child self could not protect my mother. I could not resolve why when he had slapped her, I felt the blunt force behind the thrust of his blast. I could not resolve why all of this was happening or why it happened so often, so abundantly. As I sat in my room alone, I began to cry. My tears formed into words settled into poetry. They pasted my boyhood thoughts in a contingency of spots, a notebook charged with monitoring my life. The tears spilled and the pages captured the waters in words. And as I cried, I wished that someday there would come an end to the strife that now followed me. So I created a world of my own in my room. It was a place that only I understood. It was a place that separated me from the rest of the world. More importantly, it separated me from these concerns. I had a bed in my room which seemed to get more comfortable as each night passed. It was given to my mother by a sister who had recently bought her sons new beds. My mom gave one of the beds to me, arguing what I had suspected about the floor, that it was no bed. I took the bed that she gave me and transformed it into a vehicle that allowed me to travel in my sleep. Here I dreamt of peace and happiness. I explored moments of solace, times when children would compliment me for being intelligent instead of beating me. I bore witness to the freedom of imagination, the still scene of this concept, freedom, which was so vivid in my imagination, became my destination. Although I ran still, the barb of my knees now pointed in this direction. I knew from my dreams that freedom was far from where I stood. It was hidden in a place where my imagination once had taken me. It was a place buried deeply within my dreams. It was not in Detroit. As I sat in my room alone, I heard a loud cry. It was my mother. She was running through the house as if someone were chasing her, screaming that unfulfilled question, why? The depth of her tears was as oceans touching skies, surrendering rain. They were like small images of hope that baptized her troubled soul and cleansed her naked spirit. I watched my mother from the door of my room. I watched her and a tear passed by my eye. She looked at me. I think she saw the bruises bearing upon my forehead. She began to walk toward me. She came into my room, sat on the bed next to me and continued to cry. I grabbed her with all the sympathy in my little arms and held her there. She lay there crying like a baby and fell asleep in my arms. I held her until she awakened. While she slept, I discovered the imprint of a man's hand on her face. It was an awful bruise that now made me ask the question, why? I was then reminded of what she had once told me. You're in the ghetto, boy. Don't nobody care about how you feel. You got to do what it takes to survive. But I did care what others felt. More importantly, I cared about how she felt and wondered why anyone had to live in the ghetto. To me, the question of stories and student stories sit at the center of curriculum. Because we know that schools, for some, are responsive to the stories of particular lives and yet aren't responsive to the stories of other lives. I think about my story, and I think about this young man in school and his response to his teacher. A story too long to tell. And as I was preparing this presentation, I wondered how I can make that connection between a story that's too long to tell and a story that must be told. And that story is a story about how we can and should rethink and reposition curriculum to be responsive of the particular stories that curriculum currently isn't responsive to. So in this presentation, I want to make three broad comments. One, looking at youth stories as the substance for new curriculum. Thinking about how these substances can extend topics, themes that are common to our curriculum, but also rework the educational aesthetics and reality in ways that make new meaning and new stories possible. And finally, I want to give some suggestions of what a new century curriculum can look like. And since I'm in literacy, I want to talk about literacy. I think if we complicate this notion of literacy and the literacy curriculum, we currently teach standard English instruction. We have a narrow canon of literature. And in some schools, they still teach the 5-paragraph theme. And what's interesting is that the version of English that we teach in schools don't always represent the students who come to school. So instead of English, which we teach in schools, we have outside of school Englishes. And I use the term Englishes versus dialects strategically, right? As a way to affirm the variety of voices that students come into our classrooms with. We teach a narrow canon of literature. I was in a classroom 2 weeks ago, and they were still teaching Chaucer, and they started the unit off with Beowulf. I don't think there's anything wrong with starting the unit off with Beowulf, or starting the year off with Beowulf, except for Beowulf may not hook our students into learning, right? And what was interesting was that the students were considered disengaged students because they didn't want to be, and they didn't necessarily engage Beowulf, at least Beowulf as it was written. But to my mind, we had the adjective wrong. Were the students disengaged because they didn't want to read a text that was written over 1,000 years ago? Or was the text disengaged because it didn't necessarily speak to students' lives? In another school on the South Bronx, I witnessed English teachers instructing their students in the 5-paragraph essay. I don't think there's anything wrong with the 5-paragraph essay, except for most students are going to need other type of writing resources when they enter the world. So there's a question about what are we doing in classrooms inorganically that's not necessarily responsive to the organic stuff that students will need when they leave classrooms. But worse, in what ways are we trying to speak to and fashion conversations within curriculum that will be responsive to the students' stories and the students' lives? According to Bakhtin, we live in a complex organic world. Bakhtin calls it the multi-languaged world. And this world is an organic world, a world that's fluid and always changing, right? So much so, again, if we take the English classroom, and take texts like Dante's, the Divine Comedy. Did Dante write that in the standard language of his time? Anybody? Did Dante write Divine Comedy in the standard language of his time? No. What was the standard language of Dante's time? Somebody? Italian, right? No, it wasn't Italian. He wrote it in Italian, right? He wrote the the Divine Comedy in Italian, but the standard language would have been Latin. He wrote it in the street dialect. He wrote it in the language of the tribe. How about Chaucer? When he wrote Canterbury Tales, he didn't write Canterbury Tales in the language of standardization. He didn't write it in the language of power. Instead, when he wrote Canterbury Tales, he wrote it in the street dialect. He wrote it in this language, that people in the tribe spoke. He wrote it in English. And the same thing with Shakespeare. When he started producing plays in the globe, he wrote it in a way that was responsive to the people and to people's stories. He didn't necessarily write it in the Victorian, high dialect. Instead, he wrote it in the language of the people. So what Bakhtin is saying is that this world is fluid and it changes. And that we should be responsive to those changes, which for us would mean, if we want to be like Dante, if we want to be like Chaucer, if we want to be like Shakespeare, our study of language, our study of curriculum isn't the study of, high aesthetics nor of high rhetorics. It's a study of people and people where they are. It's the study of the tribe. It's the study of the story of the little boy who ran home after getting hit in the head to a mother who was getting hit in the head. Right? It's doing what Ansel Dua said. It's teaching between borders. I define organic literacies as such. The literacies that are taught to us through the particular stories of and lives of individuals we encounter and know. Too long have we focused on the stories of the elite. I think Matthew Arnold is right. If we focus on the great works of literature, the classics, Faulkner, Dickinson, we might learn the best that's thought and said. But unfortunately, that's not all we learn. If we only read Shakespeare and Milton and Hemingway inside of our English classrooms, in our literacy classrooms, if the curriculum only reflects a certain perspective, and you happen to be black or brown and you sit in a classroom, you're not just learning the best that's thought and said, you're learning that the only people who can say the best are dead and white. But you're also learning that you can't say the best, right? So there's that hidden curriculum that's inorganic. But when we think about organic literacies, when we think about an organic place of instruction or an organic curriculum, we place value on those particular stories, experiences, languages of the people we know. Let me just do a quick thought experiment. How many of y'all think it's important to learn standard English? I think it's important to learn standard English too. But how many of you noticed that I broke a rule of standard English when I asked you, was it important to learn standard English? Which rule of standard English did I break? Anybody? Okay, let me rephrase the question. Is standard English in standard English? Is standard English in standard English? No? No, it's not, right? No, standard English is in standard English and standard English. Why? The rules break other rules. Well, we got this adjective noun rule, right? Right. So how do you modify a noun? You modify a noun with an adjective. And I just said standard English. Standard is what? Standard is a noun. And English is a noun. And so we use the noun to modify a noun. So instead, if you have a certain proximity to power, you can break the rules of standard English by creating titles like standard English instead of standardized English, right? How about this one? What part of speech is the word friend? Yeah, friend. Noun, right? Noun. The word friend is a noun. Can I friend you on Facebook? I heard some laughter. I take that as a yes, right? And I just use friend as a verb. Now my question is, why can we bend some rules? Or why can some people bend some rules and other people can't? How can we get interest in variations of English that we accommodate in classrooms and formal settings, in business settings, and not have variations of language, that not necessarily bend rules, that have their own unique rules? People like Geneva Smitherman tells us. And not necessarily accommodate them in our classrooms. This is the stuff of organic literacies. And it's organic in the sense that it's not necessarily academic. And I would argue that, the last thing that we should study in the academy is the academy. Because if we only study the academy in the academy, we'll never grow. And the academy is for growth and knowledge production and development. That we have to study the universe of thought and the various conditions of people. And again, certain people don't necessarily get represented within that universe. The principles, organic literacies, are the principles and tenets that exist in real stories. Like the story I started this presentation off with. The stories of our grandmothers and mothers, our sisters, our wives and daughters and cousins, and even our friends. So, what happens to organic literacies in inorganic spaces? I was at another school collecting data, and this student wrote this wonderful poem. Or at least I thought the poem was wonderful. U-turn left behind, legs sprawling on top of black-back mountains, rivers that run deep like Sheba's queen, and she loves open pores inside empty cups that run over hope like escalates, that faint in darkness, that freeze in night, that frick in morning uprising, light-skinned white men, blues is my brothers, black is my berry, sweet is my juice. So you turn back to me, I return back to you. It's like, wow. And he handed it in for class. And his teacher circled the U, and she circled the 4, and she put lazy in red ink in the margins. And she told him to rewrite it and make it standard. Another sidebar. Let's deal with this term standard. I like the term standard. I mean, how many of us think we should have standards? Okay, now let's do some intellectual work with this term standard. And I'm going to give you an opportunity to revise your answer after we do some intellectual work. What is the etymology of this word? Anybody? Anybody knows the etymology of the word standard? Okay. How about standard bearer? What do you think of when you hear the term standard bearer? Someone who carries a flag. And so the flag is the standard, right? But before the flag became the standard, the troops who fought for the flag were the standard. So standard in its original sense meant army. It meant regiment. Individuals who were prepared to go to war. One thought, one body, who are all in order. They were to look the same, move the same, because they were a unit. Now, my question is, if standard means this type of military unity, is that what we want? Do we want a standardized society? Do we want to sound the same? Look the same? You want to be the same? Or in what ways can we not just cherish our diversity, but look at the ways that our diversity, and there's diversity everywhere, even in Israel, and look at how that diversity, makes us rich and wealthy. And then if you take the military metaphor, to its extreme, in some ways it deletes the possibility of like this organic growth. So that was the standard sidebar. So she told him to write this poem in standard English. Not like write it in standard English, change some stuff. And to me, to my mind, why couldn't she accept his poem on its own right? Look what he's doing in the poem. So U-turn is the term U is doing what linguists call idialect. Like you can actually see the turn when you look at the word you. It's like powerful that he was able to, intellectually appropriate symbol to add flavor to his poem and deeper and new meaning to a poem. Idialect. The for comes from where he is. In the text messaging, instant messaging, smartphone era. Why wouldn't he use for? And then when we think about the content of the poem, rivers that run deep. Sounds like Langston Hughes's. The Negro speaks of rivers. Sheba's queens and open pores, empty cups that run over. It alludes to biblical passages in Psalms in the work of Solomon. Oh, sorry. And there are other things. BlackBerry, a digital device, or even a saying in African American tradition, the black is the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice. Allusions to pop culture. Blues Brothers. Blues is my brothers. I know some of you may not be old enough for that one. But so much is going on. And the poem, too, tells a story. It tells a story of a relationship between a young man and his God, with the biblical metaphors. Relationship between a young man and his would-be maiden, with allusions to love and returning. A relationship between a young man and himself, who turned his back on himself, who now turns back to see the world differently. So my question is, well, why couldn't a teacher see what was in there? What are we preparing teachers for? What is the goal of curriculum? If curriculum, one, doesn't inspire this, or two, if curriculum doesn't allow for it, what is the goal of it? Well, Derek knew what he was writing. He knew what he was doing when he wrote this, right? He writes, "It's like to tell my story, you need a new set of words. Like the language I got ain't good enough by itself to say who I am. I can't talk about everything talking correct, I give my poems an accent. An accent gives my poems an essence, you see what I'm saying? So I can use familiar sounds like freeze when I spell it different, I'm on some other stuff. I'm talking about something different. Yeah, I'm telling a different kind of story. We get our language from where we at. Right now, I'm in hip hop. The language I speak is called rap. I rap. So hip hop is going to affect the way I talk, the way I write, everything. Had his teacher known. Had his teacher known. And not only known, but was able to affirm and accommodate where he was at. He said, I'm in hip hop. And so he writes this hip hop like poem, reflecting his reality. And his teacher's red marks in the margins, somehow was terrorism to that reality. Terrorism in red ink is what I call it. Some other things that are going on in that poem. Semantic inversion. One of the least understood communicative practices in African American languages, the manipulation of European American English's semantic structure, often inappropriately dismissed as black slang. This rhetorical maneuvering amounts to linguistic appropriation, what late linguist Grace Holt called semantic inversion. It is a process whereby AAL speakers take words and concepts from EAL lexicon and either reverse their meanings or impose entirely different meanings. Well, we know that Derek did it, with certain words. Faint, added a PH to it, and he made it mean, or perhaps made it mean something different. Same thing with freeze. But the question is, did he know what he was doing with it? And here's his response. He did. These words ain't new, but they are new when I use them like this, because to me, they can mean different things. It's like the difference between fat and fat. Fat with an F means big, like out of shape. Fat spelled with a PH means that it's nice, like that fat watch you got on. It ain't out of shape. He's talking about this one. So I use the PH in the poem to make old words mean new things. Faint don't mean to fall out. It means to get away from, to fall below the radar screen of everybody. But you still operating correctly. Your game is still on point. But you just ain't putting it out there for everybody to know, because everybody ain't got your back. Freeze don't mean to be cold. It means to get free, to move quietly away from what haunts you. It's like, wow. At that point, one wonders. What is the purpose of curriculum? To my mind, we've used curriculum to tie us to the fetters of oppression, to create known outcomes and to reproduce those outcomes, where the haves remain the haves and the have-nots remain the have-nots, to legislate a certain reality, to squeeze out the creativity of students like Derek, so that they speak a certain way, act a certain way, become a certain way, right? And we do it, in the name of social justice. It's kind of like No Child Left Behind. I remember when I first heard about No Child Left Behind, they said it was a social justice policy. I'm like, wow. I mean, and it sounds like a social justice policy, because who wants to leave kids behind? Like, wow, don't nobody want to leave a kid behind. It's like, that's a social justice policy. But then you think about it, right? What's the theory behind No Child Left Behind? Oh, good, no child left untested. Essentially, that's what they do. But the other theory is that all kids are the same. All kids are the same, because you're not going to leave no kid behind. At a certain age, all kids need to be in the same place, and we know, based on the science of development, that that's not true. That you can take 100 5-year-olds, and they can be all over the place developmentally. Same thing with 4th graders. Same thing with 8th graders. The question becomes, what is the norm? What does left behind mean? Right? We never ask that question. If you're black and brown, left behind might mean not white. which becomes a particular issue of cultural assimilation and other forms of social and cultural imperialism that we rarely question. It's like these deep hidden metaphors. And the metaphor becomes, problematic and promiscuous in really interesting ways. Promiscuous in the sense that it plays with other deeply threatening metaphors like reading recovery. It's like reading recovery. Like we got triages for kids now, right? Like you don't got a good vocabulary, so I'm going to put you in triage. Or I'm going to put you in reading recovery. Why don't we have more enlightened metaphors like reading discovery? Reading discovery, where you're not a problem, where you don't have to go to the reading hospital. Instead, you can go to the reading creativity place and discover some things. And again, I can go through, maybe a dozen more like metaphors. But the issue is that we look at kids like Derek and the things that they bring to the classroom in deficit ways. That if they attempt to express their stories that may be different than the American mainstream, we want to push them in that direction of standard. I remember the first time I tried to tell my story in school. The teacher kept, trying to get me to write something else. Well, why don't you just write a paper on Martin Luther King? I don't want to write about Martin Luther King. Why don't you just, let's rethink these other things. And the stories do eventually become, too long to tell. Too long to tell simply means that I don't think this is the place for my story, which I think is even more tragic when kids come to school and they say, this isn't the place for my story. So how do we work with students? How do we work with organic literacies? First, I think we got to know what these organic literacies are and how they tell different stories, how they highlight different perspectives. This is Sarah's poem. It's a page poem that she had on her blog. And I think it's interesting and powerful. Note to self, you're not alone. And I love you. Always yourself. And at first, I said to myself, like, such a tragic poem, right? Like, nobody else can say that. She has to say it to herself, and she has to convince herself she's not alone by being alone saying, I love you, always yourself. It's like, wow, there's tragedy there. And then I reconsidered the poem, right? It's like, wow, like this is powerful. That she can tell herself, I love you. That she can tell herself, I love you, and not only do it, but do it all in lowercase. Like, wow. This is dope, right? Like she can tell herself, I love you. But also she can express it in a language that makes sense to her and throw it up on a blog in a new world. I think one thing that we haven't imagined in the curriculum and not imagining our students and our student stories, that's who our students are. Like if you think about a 16-year-old right now, when was a 16-year-old born? A kid who's 16 right now. That's a junior in high school. When? 95, right? And what happened in 95? Bill Gates came out with Windows 95. It like changed the world. So if they're born in 95 and you had Windows 95, 16 years old, they've never been without. They've never been without Internet Explorer. They've never been without, when did like the social networking craze happen? Around 98. Facebook was 2004, but before that you had Friendster and Black Planet and all these other things, they've never been without texting. They've never been without IMing. Like AIM was the thing, I think, in 95. Now you got Skype. They've never been without. And so this makes sense. Not just the you and the for in writing, but the lowercase. Because this reflects their world, and writing on blogs and in being not solitary and isolated, but a product of self. It makes sense. It's organic. It's the stuff of their creation. It's the stuff of this world. Here's another example.
Life so hard, a life through God, I pray this life you God. When this life is gone, when does this life is start? Until death do this life we part. One breath of life I begin from the tent and let it in the first place. Wipe your tears from my hurt face, say you're praying for my birth this day. Before I let my mind project into the subconscious world, slips me away. The present nightmare, making me aware of the worst that can happen to me. I feel like I'm the blindfolded, led through deserts, making me a deserving legend in its own time. Reminded of the crime thoughts I breathe, life by your creed, with my heart bleed, feeling so hurt. I'm being lost inside of a mind of a motherless child. Where do I hide deep inside? So feeling spiritual suicide. Like my inner lives, watch me, a grown man cry. Time after time, I believe I see reflections in you and me. True indeed, it's you living in me. And when I walk late at night, who's walking with me? And when I talk late night, who's talking with me? When I stand in the light of the light, where the rain falls so heavy, and every ounce and every step through eternal maze. Where does it end? In this life that never began. Wonder why life so hard, a life through God. I put this life you God. And when this life is gone, when does this life is gone? Till death do this life we part. A life through God, I put this life to God. When this life is gone, when does this life.
What's special about that production is that I saw him make it. Like he cut the video in his basement with a MacBook Pro, video camera, and I think iMovie. And so he did all of that with iMovie. The particular perspective that many of us have. And Paulo Freire, I think, writes about it best when he talks about the banking notion of education is that we believe that students come to us with nothing. And they come to us, without resources, lacking much.
It's 10 o'clock.
It's 10 o'clock. But what if we understood? It talks to me. But what if we understood that students not only have what Louis Moore calls funds of knowledge, rich funds of knowledge, but they actually know things that we don't know. Like how to cut music videos in their basement. And what if we privilege the making of music videos within classrooms as a form of composition, rich composition, again, an organic literacy, a literacy that doesn't start from us. And if you listen to the rap, it wasn't, rap for rap's sake. That is rap, told a story. A story again about God, a story about self, and a story about relationships. Whereas Sarah could love herself through his language, through his organic literacy. This young man, John Doe, can reveal his world. Another example. Sorry.
chosen. Vagina bleeds for seeds that were never planted. Poets that took trees for granted. I whisper words and never before heard verbs, and you bet that I speak louder. I don't. I only speak prouder because I shame my knowledge for college where books hide looks into father. I'm smarter than that. I know I need to stay on track, but I lack the strength in the parts where daddy left, and so my best is poetry, and I've been planting them in anthology, plans to grow future leaves where minds continue to lead actuality, reality. I don't drink. I just think to intoxicate the fallacies. The other day I laid in silence. In the night of silence, and I felt so deep, I heard the trees that were talking to me. I smelled the moon in the sky. Got so high, stars fell to my eyes, and we spoke. If I could quote, she said, Deb spoke of the melanin of an elderly woman. She said, the grill had fallen in the rain and that our history had been washed, thrown overboard slaves. I contemplated soul-searching days. I met God. At the tip of your lips, I sit his lips and pull myself away. I'm not ready to meet him. I still have more to do, more to see, so I can show him who I'm going to be. I left your lips in his face with innocence. Question. You ever walked so far into the future that the present became the past? Ever choked on words you never heard but somehow knew, saw heaven in the way the ground meets your shoe? Ever watched water drip off your skin? Ever listened? I did funny things like the ocean. I never knew life meant so much. She dripped from the faucet, traveled from the sea, from rivers and oceans, somehow found her way to me. Water tells stories, full of glory and shame, has seen hurricanes and floods of rain, has kissed the sky and earth. Felt me first when I was clean at birth. She found me again. Only this time I grew into someone new, someone who took the time to listen to the smaller things in life, to the drops of blessings we never realized fell from bigger oceans. I saw the sun mirror leaves shining across seas, bring words into my skin. Now practicing my melody. Check it. My mother had chemo the other day, and I hadn't called to see how it went. Insignificant enough to neglect my own flesh. If anything, I think that shows I'm a mess. Battling life inside me, beginning to protest. I want to cry. Internal revolution manifest. I wipe my mother away, along with tears that wet my face, wiped her far. To a remote place where I wouldn't have to acknowledge her struggle, because all it made me feel was guilt. Living as though I were ill, so I pretended not to care. To forget her years of sacrifice and despair. Also that I could throw the wind blow against my sweaty knees. Because for them, burden never really blew over her shoulders. I carry boulders of a 17-year-old girl who sacrificed the world only to water seeds of men that disregarded a garden sacred. I've done my hands in the soil of my sin, only to realize my blanket of love was legal and thread thin, so I can never be further. Can never think to grow future leaves if I can't pull my own weeds. Truth hurts. So I carried it with me everywhere I went at the bottom of my motherfucking purse. Knowing that I never loved my mother, only when she was great. My woman,
Okay, I just showed 3 examples, just 3 of millions and millions of examples of what an organic literacy would look like. There are a few questions that these organic literacies answer. They answer questions about, what curriculum might and can look like. They answer questions about what curriculum might and can do if we rethink and we revise it. But they also answer questions about a deeper humanity. They answer questions about our diversity, about who we are. When I talk about, teaching hip hop in school, I usually get, a few questions, right? One of the questions is, well, how can we teach hip hop in school? When we have to cover like real skills. And first I scratch my head and say, I wonder what real skills are. Like I just saw like some real skills. Not only real skills in the video making, but real skills in like the rhyme and the technique. Like these are real skills. But there's a bigger question. Other people say we should teach it in order to engage kids. We should teach it in order to connect the kids. And I think that's part of the argument that I'm making today. That if we're going to, connect to, students in, really interesting ways, if we're going to cross multiple lines of difference, we have to reconstruct curriculum. That's one point. And I don't even think that's the most important point. I think we have to teach the examples that I showed you, because this is who we are. Like, curriculum is supposed to reflect who we are. The study of things is about us, even if we're studying rocks. We're studying rocks because they're a part of us. We study history, we're studying us. And certainly when we talk about literacy and language, we're talking about us and studying us. And if we don't study, like this, the poetry that's on blogs, the page poetry on blogs, if we don't study the spoken word, that youth produce, if we don't study the hip hop, that captivates so many, our curriculum misses out. Our curriculum misses out on not just opportunities to connect, but opportunities to expand our mind, right? But it teaches students to use standard English by not stepping on the languages they already speak. It gives us a stew of languages. Because if we only give them standard English, we cripple them, right? I heard Toni Morrison give a talk once. And she started her talk off in French. It's like, wow, she knows French. And then she went into standard English. Like, wow, like very academic. And then she, slipped into African American language. It's like, wow, she speaks Ebonics too. And then she played with some other codes, and she threaded the needle of different languages in powerful ways, and we as the audience were captivated by every word she said. Not because she only spoke in standard English, but because she knew language well enough, and multiple languages well enough to speak directly to her audience and to move her audience. Right? She spoke in this space of congruence. So it's not that we let go of our goals for teaching. It's not that we let go of reading the great literatures. It's not that we let go of teaching students how to write an essay. While we teach them how to write an essay, we also teach them how to produce a music video, or give them space to teach us to produce a music video. Because that composition is important too. And so the organic curriculum follows a similar approach. Wow, everything is messed up here. It follows a similar approach to Paulo Freire's problem-posing approach to education. Problem-posing in a sense that we decenter the authority in the classroom. It's not about banking, it's not about giving, but it's about co-constructing and sharing. It's about being, and it's about from being and reflecting, taking action. And so it first seeks to empower the individual to knowledge of self and other and surroundings by introducing the substances of those things where they're best found. And that's in our particular lives. And at its most basic sense, it seeks to reveal. Reveal what are you doing in your life? How are you understanding humanity? How are you understanding your experiences? In what ways are you writing about it? And how can we think about, learn from those ways in order to make society better? This requires that we teach in new spaces and that we develop pedagogies of promise. In 1974, the Conference on College Composition and Communication issued a resolution called Students' Right to Their Own Language, which I think was a powerful resolution because it said that we as teachers should respect our students Like, wow, groundbreaking, right? We as teachers should respect our students. Bless you. And I like to extend that here. Students' right to their own, you fill in the blank. Students' right to their own ways of learning. Students' right to their own, resources in classroom, to their own raps. Students' right to love themselves. Students' right to their stories. And we can use these student resources to cross borders. Again, that space of congruence. For some reason, we believe. So if we take, the issue of, like let's say schools in Detroit. One thing that they're doing in Detroit is they have I don't know if you all heard about it. They are closing schools and they're going to have schools, class sizes that are 60 and more. Like 60 students in a class or more. And not only that, they're going to double down on the curriculum that fails. So they're going to give students, more of the books they don't want to read, more of the writing assignments that they don't want to do, more of the techniques of math that they don't want. So this is our solution to education problems. Instead of building bridges, we're going to tear bridges apart and give students more of what doesn't work. That sounds like a philosophy for success, right? If it doesn't work, I'm going to give you more of it. And my thing is, if it ain't working, why don't we try something new? So if we're starting in a place that doesn't connect with students, well, why don't we start from a place that connects to students and get them to where we want them to go by starting? Language, for instance, has bridges for border crossing. I was talking to a group of, science educators last week. And they were talking about how students aren't learning science. And, they're telling me about density and all of this stuff. And I'm like, oh, wow, great. I'm an English person. Can you speak to me in English? And that was the problem. It's not that students aren't getting it. It's that we're not speaking to them in their language. They can get it. And so I talk to these science, educators, first, instead of talking about science, let's talk about students, right? Because when I talk about English teaching, I never start with English. I don't teach English. I teach students English. And in that clause, central to that clause, are students. For these science educators, I meant the same. Central to that clause has to be students. That you teach students science. You don't teach science. And if you're teaching science and you're missing students, then you're not teaching. Right? And so, building bridges. And the other challenge is teaching in a new space. Teaching in a new space. And what do I mean by a new space? I think we have to think about the classrooms not as places or sites of indoctrination. When we enter into a classroom, or if we enter into any space, you're entering into a political space, whereas no space is neutral. Right? The decision, when you make the decision to teach, you've made a decision to promote a political agenda, a political pedagogy. Now, the question isn't whether or not it's political. It is whether you choose to acknowledge the politics in it or not. It's political. The question is, what side of politics do you want to be on? Do you want to be on the side of politics that affirms the status quo? Again, the rigid curriculum that teach some that they're worthy and others that they're not. Or do you want to be on the side of politics that uses the classroom space to transform students' lives? If we don't do better, if we don't think about the classroom and think about this opportunity to re-envision and reshape curriculum, to create organic opportunities, organic curriculums that's based on students' lives, if we don't think about that opportunity, the world is going to remain the same. And what does that same world look like? In New York City, black and brown young men. Officially, 1 in 4 graduate from high school in 4 years. That's 25%. Look around you. You're going to graduate. You're going to graduate. You're going to graduate. 1 in 4 will graduate. The job statistics aren't better. 1 in 2 have jobs in certain regions. 1 in 2. That means you get to work, you don't. You get to work, you don't, right? If we don't, things won't get better. And these correspond with the death statistics. The leading cause of death for some groups, 18 to 24, homicide. Suicide is the fastest, rate of suicide is among, black and Latino boys, 180%. If we don't think about teaching in a new space, things don't get better. We reinforce it. But if we do, imagine the possibilities. Imagine the possibilities. And if things don't get better, they can, in fact, get worse. Because the story continues. Listen, some of you want to know what happened to my mother. Some of you may not. But things at my mother's house got worse. She spent more time with her new friends. About 4 years later, she had given birth to a younger sister. My older sister moved in with an aunt because she had gotten tired of coming home and being jumped on whenever my mother was high or drunk. It was my mother's new friends who brought this influence upon her. It seemed as if she didn't care for us the same way she had before. All she cared for now was being with her new friends, drinking her life away and doing drugs. It seemed like my mother gave up on life after the tragic deaths of her mother and sister. The coarse city life was taking their toll on her. She started using crack, which had become a popular commodity on the drug-infested streets of Detroit. No longer did she buy us clothes or anything new. As a result, I often hustled at pool halls to earn money to buy my sister and me food to eat. To this day, I reason that it was not her fault for her negligence toward us. All odds had been set against her in life. She went through a school that was inorganic. The curriculum was bare, taught her to hate herself. So when she grew up, she was a victim. Bad education, bad social circumstances, bad situation. She had little help raising us. And with the tragic deaths of her sister and mother, she simply went over the edge. The city pushed many unsuspecting victims to this point. It pushed people into situations where their backs would be so pressed against the wall in desperation and the weight of the situation, they would collapse and fall helplessly with little help. One evening, I tried to reason with my mother. It seemed like a good idea at the time. I asked her if she loved us. She said, yes, not expecting what I would ask next. So why do you choose your friends over me and my sisters, Mama? Why don't you cook no more or buy us clothes like you used to? She responded saying, boy, you know it's hard and I ain't got a job. You know I love y'all. Y'all all I got. I responded, so mama, when your friends come over, y'all ain't gonna go in the door and do that stuff no more, Mama. Mama, please say no, please. There was a slight pause, silence. Do. Interruption. Someone began knocking on her door. It was her friends who immediately caught her attention. Hey girl, how you doing? I ain't hitting on too much. Did y'all bring the stuff? Uh-huh. She led them to the room and shut the door. I went to the door to try to plead with her to stop what she was about to do. She could not hear me and ignored me for those heathens she called friends. I became furious, and the flame of my anger singed my feelings for my mother. I began to pack my little sister's things. I grabbed the infant by the waist and positioned her in an awkward angle so that I can carry both her and her belongings to a safe place. I took her to my grandmother, who lived very close by, and begged her to keep my sister. There was no place for me at my grandmother's house, however, because she didn't care for me too much. She said that I looked too much like my mother. I went back to my mother's house. I didn't want to give up so easily. And when I returned, there was a gloomy silence which was pronounced in the fog of the smoke that filled the air. My mother was standing by her bedroom door, looking as dead as a zombie. Her friends were now gone. I could not tell if she missed them or anyone for that matter. She hadn't even realized that my sister and I had left. I told my mother where I had taken my sister, and then I ran away from that miserable place. That day, the streets of Detroit were my home. I could no longer take the bondage of pain. Despite my running from home, this pain still followed me. But I had no destination. There was no place for me to go. I made my bed that night on a cheap bench by the side of a bus stop. I slept the whole of 5 minutes. It was the longest night of my growing experience. Time didn't pass as fast. In fact, on this night, it dragged. So I lived alone in the paranoia of being alone in the darkness of night. I had to deal with the fear of someone doing me harm, perhaps killing me, or even worse, letting me survive. More importantly, I had to deal with the fear of what was happening to my mother. The next morning, while lying in the grass at a community park, my grandmother pulled up to me with my grandfather in their 1981 Buick station wagon. Since my grandmother was a very big woman at the time, about 300 pounds, she lifted me up and threw me in the bed of the station wagon. I'll never forget how drained I felt. I, too, like my mother, felt like giving up. But this big black woman took me from that barren park and hoisted me past her front door and began to free me in my odor-soaked clothes. I knew I smelled bad, but I didn't have the mind to care. She put me in a bed of massagingly warm water and began to wash my back. I could not respond to her love, for my weary little body was in shock. Still, the tenderness of her old time-woven hands comforted me. That night, I slept knowing that both of my sisters and I were safe. Having some consolation in this, I was somewhat relieved. However, I couldn't stop thinking about my mother. Before I had left her, I had seen in her eyes a new person. She had become someone else. It was as if some dark presence had stolen my mother's body and invaded her soul. Suddenly, I began to miss her, as if she were no longer with me. I had never dealt with death so personally until then. My heart was stomped and my head delivered an awful blow. That night, I cried an ear that followed from this pain. It was a tear that inspired within me a moan that echoed with a caustic roar. My cry was like that of the roll of thunder riding the gorging belly of hell. I wanted my mother because in times like this, I would run to her. She would provide me with the mildest shades of security. When she would soothe me, I knew that everything would be all right. She would say, "It's okay, baby." I wanted my mother, but I didn't know where to find her. Unlike me, someone who has been fortunate enough and who's had grace enough to be lifted to the other side of the line. There are countless stories like mine, or more dire, that require us to rethink, reposition, and reframe education. Thank you.